Before we looked at the static collection, now we want to turn a static collection into dynamic collection, which means that when there are changes to the array of data, the UI must adapt accordingly. To do that, we take the ones off and we have for equals and then the same syntax as what we had with the static collection. When going to my UI, I can see something's wrong. There are things missing here. How do I fix this? On my view model, we have a function called load. And on load, we can say CRS binding.data.update UI. The property that I want to affect is the data property. And the binding context that I want to use is this object here. So on the preload, we've set our data, but on the load, we are forcing an update on the actual UI. Because load is a base function that has some overloaded functionality that we can't afford to lose, we add a super.load in there. We go to a UI, refresh the page, and there is our collection of items. As you can see, I added 3 buttons for us: update, add, and remove. In the source here, you can see the implementation thereof. So let me just walk you through some of the important points. First of all, we are working with a proxy here. So this might look a little bit weird in the sense that I'm setting the data and then I'm getting the data again back. The reason is that this is not the standard array that you've added. I'll put 2 breakpoints here and then just refresh to sort of highlight the point. When I hover over this, you can see this is a stock standard array that I'm working with. Right, going into this, let me just step over here, you'll see that I'm actually working with a proxy now, which is different. So it's a wrapper that goes around the array that the binding engine taps into to help facilitate the array functionality. To update a particular item in the array, we want to use the proxy, and normally you would use this .setProperty, but note that this has now changed a little bit. We're saying CRS binding.data.setProperty, and the reason for this is that this .setProperty assumes that the object that is this is the binding context, and that's not true in this case. So each item in the proxy is its own bindable context. And so CRS binding provides you with a set property function on the path of CRS binding.data.setProperty where you can pass in any binding context and say, this is the binding context I want to update, this is the property path I want to update, and this is the value I want to update. Now technically you never have to use this .getProperty or this .setProperty. You could use the CRS binding.data.setProperty and just pass in this and then the property name and the age. The reason why we've added this is just as a nice shorthand, but this function technically wraps into this one in any way. So how do I update the value? I use CRS binding.data.setProperty. I pass in the context. In this case, it's the first item in the proxy array. I want to update the age and I want to set the value to 30. So when I click on the update button, now it's 30. Because I'm working with a proxy, we are listening to certain array modification actions, not necessarily all of them, but most of the manipulation ones like push and pop and splice and all of that stuff. So to add an item, all you need to do is tell the proxy, I want to push an item to the array as per normal. You send in the object that you want to add with the properties being set. So when I click on this button, you can see hello world 25. And the remove, I just tell the proxy that I want to perform the pop operation on the array. So when I click on pop, away it goes. Let's summarize how we did this again. we went to the template and we made this a for operation, and it works just like it would have been if it was a dot once, except that it's just a for. All of the rest here is the same. When it came to actually rendering the item, we added the item to the binding context, but on the load function, when we were ready to render it, we called CRSBinding.UpdateUI, and we said that this is the binding context I want to use, which is the current view model, and the property that I want to update is the data. So this would then fire re-rendering of the collection. Now, because we're using the proxy in both the update, the add, and the remove, we go and get the proxy as the next line of code so that we can cache it. And then in the update, we use the CRSBinding dataset property. We pass on the binding context that we want to affect, what the property is we want to affect, and the value we want to use. And on both the add and remove, we just use the standard push and pop array functions to manage those actions. As you can imagine, there's a lot more overhead to doing dynamic arrays. Each array item has to have its own binding context. There's proxies that get wrapped, so it's a far more memory intensive usage of items and should only be used on collections where you know for a fact there will be a lot of updates happening quite frequently, and you want to maintain those updates effortlessly so you don't have to do it manually. We recommend using static as much as humanly possible because it's by far the cheapest way of dealing with those items, but there are scenarios where you just don't want to do that. You are happy to undergo the overhead. Just make sure that you use the dynamic collection, knowing that you are actually introducing a lot more overhead to be able to manage those individual items.